I was staring at the pile of splintered wood and twisted metal where my dad's workshop used to stand when I realized my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The entire structure, a beautiful custom-built workshop that my father had poured his heart and soul into for 30 years, had been reduced to rubble by a demolition crew, and the only person standing there to explain it was a middle-aged woman in a pink cardigan with her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "I'm sorry, but this was an abandoned structure on HOA property," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "We sent multiple notices to the last known address." "My dad died 3 months ago," I said, my voice barely steady. "This workshop was his pride and joy, and it's not abandoned. I own it." The woman, whose name tag read Brenda Patterson, HOA president, gave me a look that suggested she thought I was lying. "Sir, our records show this building has been vacant for over 4 months. No one responded to our certified letters, and per our community bylaws, structures that are not maintained and appear abandoned can be removed for the safety and aesthetics of the neighborhood." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This couldn't be happening. I had just buried my father, Russell Franklin Sr., 2 weeks ago after a long battle with cancer. The last thing I needed was to deal with some power-hungry HOA president who thought she could just demolish private property without consequence. "Where are these notices you claim to have sent?" I asked, pulling out my phone to start documenting everything. I took photos of the destruction, of Brenda, of the demolition equipment still parked nearby. "They were sent to 482 Pinewood Lane, the address on file for this property," Brenda said, consulting her tablet. "We followed all proper procedures, Mr. Franklin, Robert Franklin, and my father never lived at that address. He lived at 1247 Oakmont Drive in Portland, Oregon, for the last 15 years. This workshop is on a separate parcel of land that he purchased in 2010. Brenda's expression flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Well, that's not what our records indicate. This property is part of the Riverside Meadows HOA, and all structures must comply with our architectural guidelines. This workshop was not only abandoned, but also in violation of multiple codes." "Do you have any proof that you own this property?" Another voice chimed in. A man in his 50s had walked up, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. "I'm Derek Matheson, HOA Vice President. We've been trying to clean up this eyesore for months." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I have the title deed, the property tax records, and a recent appraisal. This workshop was appraised at $45,000 just 6 weeks ago because I was planning to renovate it and use it for my own woodworking business." That got their attention. Brenda's face went pale, and Derek actually took a step back. "That's impossible," Brenda said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "We would have known if this was private property." "Apparently not," I said. "And now you've just demolished a $45,000 building without the owner's permission. I'd say that's a pretty serious problem." I could see the gears turning in Brenda's head as she tried to figure out how to spin this situation to her advantage, but I wasn't going to give her the chance. I'd spent the last 3 months watching my father waste away, holding his hand through chemo treatments that didn't work, and listening to him talk about all the projects he wished he'd finished in his workshop. That building had been more than just wood and metal to him. It had been his sanctuary, his creative space, the place where he'd built furniture for my childhood bedroom, where he'd taught me how to use a lathe, where he'd spent countless hours bringing his visions to life. And these people had just destroyed it like it was trash. "I'm calling my lawyer," I said, already scrolling through my contacts. "And I suggest you contact yours because this is going to get expensive for your HOA." Derek held up his hands in what he probably thought was a placating gesture. "Now, let's not be hasty here. I'm sure we can work something out. If there was a mistake in our records, we can certainly discuss compensation." "Compensation?" I felt my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You demolished my property. This isn't something you can just throw a few $100 at and make go away." "We followed all proper legal procedures," Brenda insisted, but she was pulling out her own phone now, her fingers flying across the screen. "We have documentation of everything." "Great," I said. "My lawyer will want to see all of it. Every notice you claim to have sent, every meeting where this was discussed, every vote that was taken, all of it." I found the number for James Morrison, an attorney who'd handled my dad's estate planning. He answered on the third ring. "James, it's Robert Franklin. I need your help. The HOA just demolished my father's workshop. They're claiming it was abandoned property. But I have the title deed and a recent appraisal." I could hear James's sharp intake of breath. "They did what? Don't move, don't sign anything, and don't let them remove any equipment or debris. I'm on my way. What's the address?" I gave him the location, a plot of land just outside the main Riverside Meadows subdivision in Beaverton, Oregon, a suburb of Portland. My dad had specifically purchased this parcel because it was technically outside the main HOA boundaries, or at least that's what he'd believed when he bought it. "They're claiming this property is part of their HOA, I told James, but Dad's deed says otherwise." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, James said. "In the meantime, document everything. Photos, videos, get the names of everyone present, including the demolition company." After I hung up, I turned back to Brenda and Derek. "My lawyer's on his way. I'm going to need the names and contact information for your demolition company, copies of all your notices and documentation, and the names of everyone on your HOA board." "We don't have to give you anything," Brenda said, but she looked nervous now. "Actually, you do," I said. "Because if you don't, it's just going to look worse for you when this goes to court, and trust me, it's going to court." A few other people had started to gather, neighbors curious about the commotion. An elderly woman in a gardening hat approached cautiously. "What happened here?" she asked, looking at the rubble. "I remember when Russell was building this place. He used to let my grandson help him on weekends." "You knew my father?" I asked, turning to her gratefully. "Oh yes, dear. I'm Martha Chen. I live just down the road. Russell was such a kind man. He built a beautiful bookshelf for me about 5 years ago. Is this his workshop? What happened?" "The HOA demolished it," I said. "They're claiming it was abandoned." Martha's face flushed with anger. "Abandoned? Russell was here just 4 months ago. I saw him working on something, though he did look terribly ill. I tried to bring him some soup, but he said he was heading home soon." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" I asked, my heart racing. "As a witness?" "Absolutely," Martha said firmly. She turned to Brenda with a look of pure disgust. "Brenda Patterson, you should be ashamed of yourself. That man built beautiful things in this workshop. My grandson learned valuable skills helping him, and you just destroyed it?" "Mrs. Chen, this doesn't concern you," Brenda said, her voice tight. "This is HOA business." "It concerns me when you're destroying the property of my friends," Martha shot back. "And I know for a fact that Russell owned this land. He showed me the deed when he first bought it. He was so proud that he'd found a spot where he could build his workshop exactly the way he wanted, without HOA restrictions." That was interesting. My dad had specifically mentioned wanting to avoid HOA oversight. So how had Riverside Meadows claimed jurisdiction over his property? James arrived faster than expected, pulling up in his silver Lexus with an expression that meant business. He was in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes that took in the scene immediately. "Robert," he said, shaking my hand firmly before turning to Brenda and Derek. "I'm James Morrison, Mr. Franklin's attorney. I understand you've demolished his property without authorization." "We had authorization," Brenda said, but she sounded less confident now. "The property was abandoned and in violation of HOA codes." "Do you have proof that this property falls under your HOA's jurisdiction?" James asked, pulling out a leather portfolio and a pen. "It's within the Riverside Meadows boundaries," Derek said. "All properties within those boundaries are subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "And where exactly are those boundaries defined?" James asked. "Because I have Mr. Franklin Sr.'s title deed here, and it makes no mention of HOA membership or obligations." He pulled out a folder I hadn't known he'd brought. My dad must have kept his documents with James for safekeeping. "The deed is dated 2010, James continued. "It clearly shows this parcel is separate from the main subdivision. So I'll ask again. What gives your HOA the authority to demolish a structure on private property?" Brenda and Derek exchanged glances. "We'll need to consult with our legal counsel," Brenda said finally. "You do that," James said. "In the meantime, I'll be filing an emergency restraining order to prevent you from removing any debris or evidence from this site. I'll also be requesting a full accounting of your HOA's decision-making process regarding this demolition, including all votes, meeting minutes, and correspondence." "We followed proper procedures," Brenda repeated, but it sounded like a mantra now, something she was telling herself as much as us. "We'll see about that," James said. "Robert, let's walk the property line. I want to document exactly where your father's parcel begins and ends." We spent the next hour carefully mapping out the property, taking photos and videos from every angle. James had brought a surveyor's report from when my dad had purchased the land, and we used it to mark the corners of his property with bright orange flags. The workshop had sat squarely in the center of my dad's land, a good 50 feet from the nearest boundary line with the HOA controlled areas. There was no way this could be considered HOA property unless someone had seriously screwed up the records. Martha stayed with us the whole time, pointing out where she'd seen my dad working when she'd last seen him, and confirming that he'd always been meticulous about maintaining the workshop. Other neighbors started coming by too, sharing their own memories of my father and expressing their shock at what the HOA had done. By the time we finished documenting everything, I had statements from 6 different witnesses who could confirm that my father had actively used the workshop until shortly before his death, that he'd owned the property outright, and that he'd specifically chosen this location to avoid HOA interference. "This is good," James said as we sat in his car reviewing everything on his laptop. "Really good. They don't have a leg to stand on. The question is whether they genuinely made a mistake, or if this was intentional." "Why would it be intentional?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. James pulled up a document on his screen. "I did some research on the drive over. The Riverside Meadows HOA has been trying to expand their boundaries for the last 3 years. They want to incorporate several outlying properties to increase their dues base and their authority. Your father's parcel is right in the middle of the area they've been targeting. So they just decided to destroy his workshop and claim the land was abandoned?" I felt sick. "It's possible," James said carefully. "Or it's possible someone on the board genuinely believed they had jurisdiction and didn't do their due diligence. Either way, they're liable for the damages." "I want more than just damages," I said. "I want them held accountable. My dad loved that workshop. He spent 30 years collecting tools, building equipment, perfecting his craft, and they destroyed it in an afternoon." "We'll hold them accountable," James promised. "Trust me, by the time we're done, the entire HOA board is going to wish they'd checked their property records more carefully." Over the next few days, things moved quickly. James filed a lawsuit against the Riverside Meadows HOA for unlawful destruction of property, trespass, and negligence. He also filed complaints with the county about the demolition, which had apparently been done without the proper permits. That last bit was particularly interesting. The demolition company, when contacted, claimed they'd been told by the HOA that all necessary permits were in place. But when the county inspected their records, there was no demo permit on file for my dad's property. "They forged the permit," James told me during a phone call. "Or rather, they submitted one with incorrect property information. The address they used was for a different parcel, one that actually is within the HOA boundaries and was approved for demolition last year." "So they basically committed fraud," I said. "Multiple counts," James agreed. "The question is whether it was intentional fraud or negligent fraud. That's going to come out in discovery." The HOA's response to our lawsuit was predictable. They denied everything, claimed they'd followed all proper procedures, and insisted that the property was within their jurisdiction. They also filed a counterclaim, arguing that my father had violated HOA covenants by building an unpermitted structure. But their case started falling apart almost immediately. When forced to produce their records during discovery, it became clear that the HOA had never actually verified the property boundaries before ordering the demolition. They'd simply assumed that because the workshop was visible from HOA properties and near their boundaries, it must be part of their jurisdiction. The notices they'd sent had all gone to the wrong address, 482 Pinewood Lane, which turned out to be a vacant lot that had never had a structure on it. When questioned about how they'd obtained that address, Brenda claimed it was in their database, but no one could explain how it got there or why no one had verified it before proceeding with demolition. The deeper James dug, the worse it looked for the HOA. It turned out that Brenda had been pushing aggressively for the demolition, claiming the workshop was an eyesore that was bringing down property values. Several board members had expressed concerns about whether they had the authority to act, but Brenda had assured them everything was legal and proper. She wanted that land, James explained during one of our meetings at his office. I've been going through the HOA's internal emails, and Brenda had been in contact with a developer who's interested in buying parcels in the area for a new commercial project. Your dad's land is worth a lot more than $45,000 if it's rezoned for commercial use. So she demolished his workshop hoping to what, force a sale? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's hard to prove intent, James said, but the circumstantial evidence is pretty damning. She knew or should have known that the property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. She failed to do due diligence before ordering the demolition, and she had a financial motive to clear the land. Can we bring criminal charges? I asked. Possibly, James said. What they did could be prosecuted as criminal mischief or malicious destruction of property. I've been in contact with the district attorney's office, and they're reviewing the case. 3 weeks after the demolition, I got a call from Detective Sarah Palmer of the Beaverton Police Department. She wanted to meet with me to discuss the incident. We met at a coffee shop near the police station, and Detective Palmer turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes that reminded me of James. Mr. Franklin, I've been reviewing the evidence in your case, she said after we'd sat down. I have to say, what happened to your father's property is one of the more egregious examples of HOA overreach I've seen. So you think there's a criminal case? I asked hopefully. I think there might be, she said carefully. The question is whether we can prove criminal intent or if this was just incredibly negligent behavior. Your attorney has provided us with a lot of documentation, and we're conducting our own investigation. What do you need from me? I asked. Tell me about your father, she said. When did he last use the workshop? What was his relationship with the HOA? Did he ever have conflicts with Brenda Patterson or other board members? I told her everything I could remember. My dad had been a carpenter by trade, and after he retired, he'd turned his hobby into a small business, building custom furniture for clients. The workshop had been his dream, a space where he could work without the noise complaints and restrictions he'd dealt with in our old neighborhood. Gaff. He specifically bought that land because it wasn't part of the HOA, I explained. He'd had problems with our previous HOA in Portland. They tried to stop him from running his business out of his garage, claiming it violated residential use restrictions. So when he found this parcel in Beaverton, outside the subdivision boundaries, he thought he'd finally found the perfect spot. And he never had contact with the Riverside Meadows HOA, Detective Palmer asked. Not that I know of, I said. He was friendly with some of the neighbors, like Martha Chen, but he avoided anything to do with the HOA itself. Detective Palmer made notes on her tablet. We've been interviewing board members and neighbors. Several people have confirmed that your father was actively using the workshop until he became too ill to work. There's no question that the property wasn't abandoned. So what happens now? I asked. We continue investigating, she said. We're particularly interested in the communications between Brenda Patterson and this developer, Richard Calloway. If we can establish that she knowingly demolished your father's workshop to clear the land for a sale, that's a much more serious crime than simple negligence. Over the next month, the investigation intensified. Richard Calloway, it turned out, had been courting Brenda for months, trying to convince the HOA to sell several parcels of communal land for his development project. My dad's workshop sat right in the middle of where Calloway wanted to build. James obtained emails showing that Brenda had promised Calloway she could deal with the workshop problem. When confronted with these emails during a deposition, Brenda claimed she'd meant going through proper legal channels to address code violations, not demolishing the structure. But other evidence painted a different picture. The demolition had been rushed through without proper board approval. Brenda had hired the demolition company herself and told them the project was urgent. She had also failed to disclose to the rest of the board that the property ownership was questionable. This is looking more and more like criminal conduct, James told me after Brenda's deposition. She knew or strongly suspected that your father owned that property, but she went ahead with the demolition anyway because she thought she could either force you to sell or claim it was an honest mistake. What about the other board members? I asked. Are they liable too? Civilly, yes, because the HOA as an entity is responsible for the actions of its president, James explained. But criminally, it looks like this was mostly Brenda's doing. Derek Matheson and the other board members were negligent in not doing their due diligence, but they genuinely seemed to have believed Brenda when she told them everything was legal and proper. The civil case went to mediation first. The HOA's insurance company, realizing they were facing massive liability, wanted to settle. They offered $50,000, which would have covered the appraised value of the workshop plus some additional compensation for my time and stress. I turned it down. "It's not about the money," I told James. "My dad spent 30 years building that workshop, collecting tools, creating a space where he could work on his craft. $50,000 doesn't come close to replacing what they destroyed." "What do you want?" James asked. I'd been thinking about that a lot. "I want them to acknowledge what they did was wrong. I want Brenda Patterson removed from the board and banned from serving in any HOA leadership position. I want a full apology published in the community newsletter. And I want enough money to rebuild the workshop exactly the way my dad had it, with the same tools and equipment." "That's going to cost a lot more than $50,000, James warned. "Then they shouldn't have demolished it in the first place," I said. We went back to the mediation table with my demands. The insurance company balked at first, but James laid out all the evidence we had, including the pending criminal investigation. If this went to trial and a jury heard about how an HOA president had deliberately destroyed a dying man's workshop for personal gain, the damages could easily exceed $1 million. They settled for $350,000. The money would cover rebuilding the workshop, replacing all the equipment, compensating me for the loss of my father's custom-built pieces that had been destroyed, and acknowledging the emotional distress caused by their actions. But that wasn't the only outcome I wanted. I pushed for criminal charges, and Detective Palmer's investigation had uncovered enough evidence to support them. 4 months after the demolition, Brenda Patterson was arrested and charged with criminal mischief in the first degree, a felony in Oregon. The charge carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $125,000. The arrest made local news. I'll never forget seeing Brenda being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face red with anger and embarrassment. Part of me felt bad for her. She was in her 50s, had probably never been arrested before, and was about to lose everything over a decision she'd made in pursuit of what she thought was a good business deal. But then I remembered my dad's workshop reduced to rubble, and the sympathy faded. The criminal case took another 6 months to wind through the system. Brenda's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office wasn't interested in letting her off easy. The evidence was too strong, and they wanted to send a message that HOAs couldn't just destroy people's property with impunity. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution laid out the timeline of events, showed the jury the emails between Brenda and Richard Calloway, and presented testimony from board members who said Brenda had misled them about the property ownership. James testified about the title records and how clear it was that my father owned the property. Martha Chen testified about seeing my father working in the workshop just months before it was demolished. I testified too, telling the jury about my father's love for his workshop, how he'd spent decades perfecting his craft, how the space had been his sanctuary during his final months of life. I showed them photos of the furniture he'd built, the tools he'd collected, the projects he'd been working on before he got too sick to continue. The defense tried to argue that Brenda had made an honest mistake, that she'd relied on faulty HOA records, and that she'd never intended to destroy private property. But the prosecution pointed to the emails, the rushed timeline, the lack of proper verification, and Brenda's financial interest in clearing the land. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. "Ms. Patterson, you held a position of trust in your community," he said. "People relied on you to make decisions that were in the best interest of the neighborhood, not your own personal financial gain. Instead, you abused that trust in the worst possible way. You destroyed a man's property, his life's work, without proper authorization or verification. The harm you caused goes beyond the monetary value of what was destroyed. You took away a piece of Mr. Franklin's father, a connection to his memory that can never be fully restored." Brenda was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of early release after 18 months for good behavior. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $50,000 on top of what the HOA's insurance had already paid. The courtroom was packed with people from the Riverside Meadows community. Some had come to support Brenda, but most had come to witness justice being served. Several neighbors came up to me after the sentencing to express their support and share their own horror stories about HOA overreach. "Thank you for fighting this," Martha Chen said, hugging me tightly. "Your father would be so proud of you." The aftermath of the case rippled through the community for months. The entire Riverside Meadows HOA board resigned in shame. A new board was elected, and one of their first actions was to implement strict new procedures for any action taken on questionable properties. They also hired a professional management company to oversee their operations and ensure nothing like this happened again. Richard Calloway's development project fell apart when the negative publicity made it impossible for him to secure financing. The last I heard, he'd left Oregon entirely and was trying to start over in Arizona. I used the settlement money to rebuild my dad's workshop, but I didn't just recreate what had been there before. I made it better. I hired the best contractors, used the finest materials, and installed state-of-the-art equipment. But I also incorporated as many of my dad's original design elements as I could, using photos and my own memories to capture the spirit of what he'd created. The most important thing I did was salvage what I could from the rubble. The demolition company had mixed everything together, but I spent weeks sorting through the debris, pulling out pieces of my dad's work. I found parts of the workbench he'd built, fragments of his tool organizers, pieces of unfinished projects. I incorporated all of it into the new workshop, creating a space that honored his memory while moving forward. I also found my dad's journal in the debris, water-damaged, but mostly readable. He'd kept notes on every project, every technique he'd learned, every idea he'd had for future work. Reading through it was painful and beautiful at the same time. It was like having one last conversation with him, hearing his voice in the careful notes and sketches. The workshop reopened almost exactly 1 year after it had been demolished. I invited everyone who had supported me through the case, James, Detective Palmer, Martha Chen, all the neighbors who had testified or provided statements. We had a small ceremony where I officially dedicated the space to my father's memory. "Russell Franklin spent his life creating beautiful things," I said to the gathered crowd. "He taught me that craftsmanship matters, that taking pride in your work matters, that building something with your own hands is one of the most human things you can do. The HOA took away his workshop, but they couldn't take away his legacy. This space will continue his work, and it will stand as a reminder that no organization, no matter how powerful they think they are, has the right to destroy what someone has built." I started taking on custom furniture projects just like my dad had done. My first commission was a bookshelf for Martha Chen's great-granddaughter. It felt right, creating something for the family of the woman who had stood up for my father when it mattered most. As word spread about the quality of my work and the story behind the workshop, more clients started reaching out. I found myself building dining tables, cabinets, bed frames, all the same types of pieces my dad had loved making. Every time I worked with wood, measuring and cutting and sanding and finishing, I felt connected to him. The legal precedent set by the case also had wider implications. Other HOAs in Oregon started reviewing their procedures and records more carefully, terrified of facing similar lawsuits. Several state legislators even proposed new laws to strengthen property rights and limit HOA powers, citing my case as an example of how badly things could go wrong. I was invited to speak at a property rights conference in Salem, where I told the story of what had happened and advocated for stronger protections for homeowners. It was surreal standing in front of hundreds of people, talking about my dad's workshop and the importance of respecting property rights. But it felt meaningful too, like I was turning something terrible into something positive. James became a good friend through all of this. We'd started out with a professional relationship, but fighting this battle together had bonded us. He told me that my case had rekindled his passion for law, reminding him why he'd become an attorney in the first place. "Most of what I do is boring corporate work," he admitted over beers one night. "But your case, fighting for something that really mattered, that was special. It reminded me that the law can actually help people, not just shuffle money around. Detective Palmer also stayed in touch. She told me that the investigation into Brenda Patterson had been one of the most satisfying cases of her career. Usually with property crimes, it's hard to get people to care, she said. But your case had everything: a sympathetic victim, a clear villain, a David versus Goliath narrative. It made it easy to get support from the DA's office and the resources we needed to build a strong case. 2 years after the workshop was demolished, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Brenda Patterson, written from the minimum security facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter was an apology, more genuine than anything she'd said during the legal proceedings. She wrote about how she'd let her ambition cloud her judgment, how she'd convinced herself that what she was doing was for the good of the community, when really it was about the money she'd make from Callaway's deal. She wrote about the shame she felt, knowing that she'd destroyed something irreplaceable and hurt so many people in the process. "I know I can never make this right," she wrote. "I can never give you back your father's original workshop or undo the pain I caused. But I want you to know that I think about what I did every day, and I'm genuinely sorry. If I could go back and make different choices, I would. But I can't. So all I can do is try to be a better person going forward." I sat with that letter for a long time, unsure how to feel. Part of me was still angry, still hurt by what she'd done. But another part of me recognized that she was human, that she'd made terrible choices and was paying the price for them. I didn't respond to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. I filed it with all the other documents from the case, a reminder that even the people who hurt us are complicated, flawed human beings who sometimes do terrible things. The workshop became more than just a place where I worked. It became a gathering spot for the community. I started teaching woodworking classes on Saturday mornings, passing on the skills my dad had taught me. Young people from the neighborhood would come by to learn how to use tools, to understand the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands. Martha Chen's great-grandson, Timothy, became one of my regular students. He was 12 years old and had the same enthusiasm for woodworking that I'd had at his age. Watching him carefully measure and cut his first dovetail joint, his face scrunched up in concentration, reminded me so much of learning the same skill from my dad. "My great-grandma says your dad used to let my dad help him when he was young," Timothy said one afternoon while we were working on a birdhouse project. "Really?" I asked. I'd known Martha's family had a connection to my dad, but I hadn't realized it went back that far. "Yeah, my dad says Mr. Franklin taught him patience and precision," Timothy said. "He says those lessons helped him in his career as an engineer. That's why he wanted me to learn woodworking too. It struck me then how much impact my father had had on people beyond just the furniture he'd built. He'd taught skills, instilled values, and created connections that had rippled through generations. And now I had the opportunity to continue that legacy. The 3rd year after the demolition, I decided to expand the workshop. I added a small gallery space where I could display finished pieces and where other local artisans could show their work. I also built an outdoor pavilion where we could hold community events and larger classes. The expansion was approved quickly by the new Riverside Meadows HOA board, who bent over backwards to be helpful and supportive. They'd learned their lesson about property rights and due diligence. I invited the board president, a thoughtful man named Gregory Sullivan, to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new gallery space. "On behalf of the Riverside Meadows HOA, I want to apologize again for what happened to your father's workshop," Gregory said during his speech. "What occurred under the previous board was inexcusable, and we've worked hard to ensure nothing like that ever happens again. But more than that, we want to celebrate what you've built here. This workshop is an asset to our community, a place where people can learn, create, and connect. Your father would be proud." Standing there in the workshop, surrounded by friends, neighbors, students, and supporters, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before my dad got sick. The building itself wasn't the same one he'd built. The new workshop was actually nicer in many ways, but the spirit was the same. This was still a place where creativity flourished, where people learned valuable skills, where beautiful things were made. I'd learned a lot through this whole experience. I'd learned that HOAs could be incredibly destructive when led by the wrong people, but also that communities could come together to demand better. I'd learned that the legal system, for all its flaws, could deliver justice when people were persistent and had good evidence. I'd learned that even in the face of terrible loss, it was possible to rebuild and create something meaningful. Most importantly, I'd learned that my father's legacy wasn't contained in any single building or collection of tools. His legacy was in the skills he'd taught me, the values he'd instilled, the connections he'd made with people throughout his life. The HOA had destroyed his workshop, but they hadn't destroyed what really mattered. I still have the title deed and the appraisal paperwork framed on the wall of the workshop, a reminder of how important it is to know your rights and stand up for them. Next to them, I hung a photo of my dad in his original workshop, smiling at the camera with sawdust in his hair and a chisel in his hand. Sometimes students ask about the photo and the framed documents, and I tell them the story, not to dwell on the negative, but to teach them about the importance of documentation, property rights, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. The workshop my dad built may have been torn down, but what he created through decades of hard work and dedication lives on. Every piece of furniture I complete, every student I teach, every connection I make through this space is a continuation of his work, and that's something no HOA can ever destroy, no matter how hard they try. The final legal loose end was tied up 4 years after the initial demolition. The Riverside Meadows HOA, under its new leadership, formally deeded me a 20-foot easement around my property to ensure there would never be any future boundary disputes. They also erected a small sign at the entrance to the workshop property reading, "Franklin Woodworking Studio established 2010," acknowledging both my dad's original vision and the continuation of his work. I built a small memorial garden next to the workshop using some of the original lumber salvaged from the demolished building. In the center, I placed a bench my dad had been working on before he got sick. I'd found the pieces in the rubble and finished the project according to his journal notes. It wasn't perfect. My joinery wasn't quite as clean as his would have been, but it was functional and beautiful in its own way. The bench became a favorite spot for Martha Chen, who would come by several times a week to sit and chat about the neighborhood, her family, and her memories of my father. On warm afternoons, we'd share coffee and stories, and I'd learn more about the man my dad had been to other people in the community. "Your father once told me that every piece of wood has a story," Martha said during one of these visits. "He said a good craftsman learns to listen to the wood, to understand what it wants to become." I think about that a lot. It's a nice philosophy for life too, isn't it? Understanding what you're meant to become and having the patience to get there. Those words stayed with me. In many ways, that was what the last 4 years had been about, understanding what I was meant to become in the wake of my father's death and the destruction of his workshop. I'd started out angry and hurt, focused only on getting justice and compensation, but through the process, I'd discovered a calling, a purpose that went beyond just winning a legal battle. I'd become a teacher, a craftsman, and a community builder. I'd learned to honor my father's memory, not by trying to recreate what he'd built exactly as it was, but by taking the foundation he'd laid and building something new on top of it. The legal victory over the HOA was important, and Brenda Patterson's prosecution sent an important message about accountability. But the real victory was in what I'd created from the ruins, a space that brought people together, taught valuable skills, and continued the work my father had started decades ago. On the 5th anniversary of my dad's death, I held a special open house at the workshop. I invited everyone who had been part of the journey, the lawyers, the detective, the neighbors, the students, the craftspeople who displayed their work in the gallery. We spent the day celebrating not just my father's life, but the community that had formed around his legacy. Timothy, now a confident 17-year-old, gave a demonstration of advanced joinery techniques to a group of younger students. Watching him teach with patience and precision, I could see my father's influence carried forward to another generation. James brought his daughter, who was interested in learning woodworking. Detective Palmer came with her husband, a retired carpenter who spent an hour examining my tools and sharing stories about his own experiences in the trade. Martha Chen brought what seemed like her entire extended family, all of them eager to see the workshop that had meant so much to their matriarch. As the sun began to set and people started heading home, I found myself alone in the workshop for the first time that day. I ran my hand along the workbench, feeling the smooth wood grain under my fingers. The space smelled of sawdust and wood finish, the same smells I remembered from childhood when I'd visit my dad in his various workshops. I pulled out his journal and flipped to one of the last entries he'd written, dated just a month before he got too sick to work. It read, "Started thinking about legacy today. What do I want to leave behind? Not just furniture, though I'm proud of the pieces I've built. I want to leave the knowledge that good work matters, that taking time to do things right is never wasted, that creating something with your own hands is one of life's great joys. I hope Robert understands this someday. I hope he finds his own passion and pursues it with dedication. That's the real legacy, not the things we build, but the values we pass on." Reading those words again, 5 years after his death and 4 years after the workshop was demolished, I finally understood completely what he meant. The HOA had torn down his building, but they couldn't touch his real legacy. That lived on in me, in the students I taught, in the furniture we created, in the community we'd built around his vision. I closed the journal and looked around the workshop one more time before turning off the lights. Tomorrow I'd be back, working on a commission for a dining table, teaching an afternoon class, planning the next community event. The work continued, just as my father would have wanted. The title and appraisal documents that had saved my legal case still hung on the wall, important reminders of the battle we'd fought and won. But they were just pieces of paper in the end. The real proof of victory was all around me in every completed project, every taught skill, every person who walked through the doors and left with a greater appreciation for craftsmanship and creativity. As I locked up and walked to my car, I noticed the sign the HOA had installed at the property entrance, illuminated by a small spotlight. Franklin Woodworking Studio established 2010. My dad had established this place, and I'd rebuilt it after others tried to tear it down. Together, we'd created something that would last, something meaningful that served the community and honored the values we both held dear. That was the real story, not just about an HOA destroying property and facing consequences, but about how persistence, community support, and dedication to craft could overcome even the worst setbacks. My father had built a workshop, the HOA had demolished it, but I'd built something even better in its place. And that something would continue growing and evolving long after I was gone, carrying forward the legacy of a man who believed that good work mattered and that creating beauty with your own hands was one of life's greatest privileges. The battle with Brenda Patterson and the Riverside Meadows HOA had been painful and expensive and time-consuming. But it had also been worthwhile because it had forced me to think deeply about what really mattered, what I wanted to preserve and pass on. In fighting for my father's workshop, I'd discovered my own purpose and built something that honored his memory in the best possible way. As I drove home that evening, I thought about all the students who would learn woodworking in that space, all the furniture that would be built, all the connections that would be formed. The workshop would outlast the legal battles, the bad decisions of a corrupt HOA president, and even my own lifetime. It would stand as a testament to the power of craftsmanship, community, and the enduring impact one person can have when they dedicate themselves to creating something meaningful. My father had left me more than just a building and some tools. He left me a philosophy, a set of values, and an example of how to live a life focused on creation rather than destruction, on building rather than tearing down. The HOA had tried to destroy that, but they'd failed. They'd only managed to make it stronger, to spread it further, to ensure that more people would benefit from the legacy Russell Franklin Sr. had worked a lifetime to create. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all.